You know, come to think of it, I haven't yet done a video on a low-end dedicated GPU that's PCI Express. I have done the Radeon i250 review, but that's an AGP card. However, today I have decided to change that as I bring you this red turd onto the table. This bastard right here is the AMD/ATI Radeon HD 4350. Yes, I know, just by mentioning that name you probably got bored and want to click off this video, but bear with me. It's a fairly boring low-end GPU that wasn't really meant for high-end gaming. But let's talk about its history. In June of 2008, AMD, who 2 years ago bought ATI, released the HD 4850 and 4870. These cards were awesome. Every game you threw at them would run with silky smooth frame rates, and the prices were very competitive. The HD 4870 was also the first GPU to use GDDR5 memory. About 2 months later, AMD released the 4870X2, basically two 4870 dies on a single card running in Crossfire. On September 10th, the HD 4600 series was released. Those cards were more geared towards the entry-level market. They didn't give out spectacular performance, but for the price, it made decent amount of sense for a build on a budget. And then just 20 days later, AMD released two low-end GPUs, the HD 4550 and the 4350. They were essentially the same card minus slightly higher clocks on the 4550. Reviewers liked that the cards were pretty decent options for HD PC, but said that if you care about playing games, you should spend a little bit more and buy the 4670. But fuck listen to what other reviewers say, because we're gonna game on this thing, believe it or not. The exact HD 4350 we're gonna use today is this passively cooled version from Asus. It looks plain but could have been worse. Since this is a power efficient HD PC card, it doesn't need any additional PCIe power, and ports wise, you get DVI, VGA, and a really obscure connector that nobody ever heard of called HDMI, which can apparently send both video and audio data. Now that's fancy as fuck. Sarcasm aside, the port selection is decent for the time. The specs didn't impress anyone, even in 2008. It uses the very small RV710 die that's based on the 55nm terascale architecture. The GPU features 80 chain units, 8 TMUs, 4 RLPs, 1 compute unit, 512 MB of DDR2 running a memory bus of 64 bits, core clock of 600 MHz, memory clock of 400 MHz, support for DirectX 10.1 and OpenGL 3.3, share model 4.1 and a TDP of only 20 watts. And don't worry, at the end I will overclock this bastard. So yeah, not exactly flashy, but the question remains, what kind of games can we play on this thing? For this we're gonna use a PC featuring an Intel Core 2 Duo E7500 that had a massive overclock to 4.1 GHz, 4 GB of RAM and Windows XP. Now I know what you're thinking.
But fake tech, this is a DirectX 10 card.
Don't worry, we will install a newer operating system to try a few newer games as well, just for shits and giggles, but we will focus mainly on older ones. In 3 Marco 3, the HD 4350 managed a score of 6804, which is somewhat on par with say a Radeon 9800 Pro, which isn't bad, but from 2003 to 2008, video games have evolved quite a bit, let's just say. The situation is somewhat similar in 06, where we got a score of 2272. The first game I tried was Far Cry. On paper the HD 4350 handled the game decently, with a nice A4 FPS average. However, judging by the disappointing 1% and 0.1% lows, the game didn't feel as smooth as it should have been. It felt jerky at times. Whenever you moved the mouse, the game had this weird jitter. When the game ran at 60 FPS, it felt more like 30. It's definitely strange and also kinda distracting, which is a shame because on paper the result is pretty good. UT 2004 meanwhile had no such issues and was decent to play. Given the pretty high resolution settings, the HD 4350 did the job somewhat in this intensive Inferno map. However, I won't call it an amazing experience either. Simple stuff like shooting with the minigun would tank the framerate below 50 FPS, as shown by the 1% lows. Half-Life 2, the original 2004 build that is, was a really pleasant surprise. Playing the first part of Root Canal, the game actually ran pretty damn good at high settings with the X9. Now, it wasn't flawless when the action heated up with shit flying around and multiple soldiers shooting. You'd see the framerate drop, as expected. But the 1% lows aren't what I would call horrible. I mean, they are pretty distant from the average FPS, but not too bad, you know. The game is definitely playable and it looks good too. With Halo, I went brave and set the settings to high with a resolution of 720p. While playing most of the opening, the game was definitely playable, but still quite far from the 60 FPS goodness you'd expect given that the card came out 7 years after this game. But yeah, with enough settings dropped, the experience should improve. But this is where the HD 4350 is showing off its weaknesses. Need for Speed Most Wanted was interesting. I first tried out the level 2 preset, which is mostly low, but with some added detail here and there, at 1024x768. The average FPS isn't that bad, I mean 44 FPS I would have been happy as a kid. However, what I do notice as a quote-unquote fully grown adult is that the framerate is really inconsistent and there is also some stuttering here and there. So I decided to keep the resolution the same but dropped everything to the lowest, including turning the visual treatment setting to low, which gets rid of the game's signature piss yellow filter, but does increase the frame rate. The average was now over 60 FPS, but the bigger difference was in the 1% low, making the game smoother overall. Now how about we punish this card with some fear? I chose the medium preset but increased the resolution to 1024x768 to make it look just a smidge nicer. However, the HD 4350 did sweat a lot in this game. 40 FPS isn't something to praise for, and what's even worse is the really bad 1% lows. The benchmark is quite demanding, but even in game it doesn't feel very smooth. So what I did was I switched to the minimum preset, but kept the same resolution and disabled pixel doubling, which as far as I know lowers the render resolution by half, and yeah, we don't want that shit near us. You could tell that some of the effects that you'd expect to be in the game were missing, explosions and all that, but it ran decently. The HD 4350 could finally cope with the game released 3 years before it. Yay, I guess. Now for grid, I decided to be merciful to the HD 4350 and dropped everything to the lowest. And believe it or not, it ran really smoothly, with very minimal input latency, no matter the opponents or track. However, the eagle eye of you might have noticed that, okay, this is actually quite obvious. The game looks like complete dog shit. Increasing the settings or the resolution could be possible, but I won't recommend both at the same time. Well, this HD 4350 actually runs Crysis like a champ, provided that you run it with the lowest settings and resolution. But 50 FPS average isn't too bad, especially if you are a PAL enjoyer. It didn't slow down too much during combat, and the game felt pretty responsive overall, minus the freezing you get when the game hits a checkpoint. It's a pretty good improvement over the GMA X4500. Though this card still isn't recommended for HD resolutions paired with the better looking medium settings. If you'd like to play older DirectX titles, you're in luck. This is Muscle Track Madness from 1996, and as you can see, with hardware acceleration enabled, the HD 4350 ran without any issues. The game didn't have any weird artifacts or other shenanigans like the ones that you will see with newer GPUs. So for those late 90s games, the HD 4350 doesn't seem like the worst choice in the world. Too bad it doesn't support Windows 98. Well, this HD 4350 did run old games fairly okay, but some of the more demanding stuff needed some cutbacks in graphical fidelity, which I guess makes sense because high-end gaming wasn't its main goal. But what about we punish this card further with newer titles? And for that I chose to install Windows 7 on the test bench. Now yes, this OS is also pretty old at this stage, but in my experience seems to be more fit than newer operating systems for LGA 775 systems. And despite Valve dropping support for Steam on Windows 7, the client still works. For how long, I have no idea, but hey, it works for now, which is nice. I should first mention that the HD 4350 worked pretty well with Windows Aero, and somehow still handles 1080p 60fps video on YouTube like an absolute champion. Now yes, this was a card that was specifically made as a cheap HDPC card, but given its age, I don't know, I am very impressed. But let's go back to gaming. For starters, I tried out 3Mark Vantage for the first time, which is meant to be a DirectX 10 test. This is where the HD 4350 got an ass whooping, scoring a GPU score of just 530. In the new version of Half-Life 2, I decided to be a little brave and keep the high settings, and set the resolution to HD. The game still ran pretty well, definitely slower than the original 2004 build, but still pretty good for a low-end GPU from 16 years ago. Holy fuck, I feel old. Next up we have Dirt 3 Complete Edition. Unlike with Grid, I decided not to be conservative with the resolution and chose 720p, although we are still using the ultra low preset, which, yeah, it doesn't look great, but the HD 4350 tried its best. The framerate is okay-ish, but you can still feel somewhat of an input lag, so I'd recommend dropping the resolution with this title, or buying a new GPU, or even buying a new system altogether, as even a low-end iGPU from current year will smoke this thing. In Trackmania, I first tried the in-game benchmark. 58 FPS average is what we got, but the 1% lows were pretty shit. You should not disagree with me, they were quite shit. However, the benchmark is pretty demanding. This is what you'll be mostly doing in Trackmania. And yeah, it's not bad. At the start of every race, it does have a small freeze. But then our HD 4350 gets its shit together and yeah, pretty good experience. In the Dark Tower benchmark from Just Cause 2, the HD 4350 really struggled at 720p, even with the lowest settings. So I lowered it to 800 by 600 where we saw 27 FPS average. However, the 1% lows were not good, and that's thanks to the huge number of explosions and other particle effects that this benchmark uses. I won't really recommend playing this game on the HD 4350 sadly. Here's an interesting game I decided to try out, Spec Ops The Line. And this is the kind of experience I'd expect from a low-end GPU from late 2000s to early 2010s, where by dropping the settings and resolution to, you guessed it, the absolute lowest, we can get to just playable frame rates. And indeed, the HD 4350 does just that. It does help that even with 37 FPS average, the input latency was pretty decent. So yes, if you're stranded in the same apocalyptic Dubai setting from the game and all you have is this card that was used only as a display adapter in some office PC, you can play this game. With Tomb Raider, I decided to benchmark the beginning of the game where Lara escapes the cave thing. The game ran surprisingly okay, but only with the lowest settings at 800 by 600. 29 FPS is alright, but keep in mind outside zones will be a little bit more demanding. Expect low to mid 20s there. When running with OpenGL, Ion Fury was a disaster. The framerate was super inconsistent. In fact, I don't need to measure it to tell you so. This is the newest game on the benchmark list, but it's not necessarily demanding, given it's based on eDuke 32, so it is a little disappointing. But here's the fun fact, switch to software rendering and the game runs at an almost consistent 60 FPS on our overclocked Core 2 Duo, even at 1440 by 900. Granted, the game is no longer really true 3D, but it is a funny discovery that I just made. Now I've decided to go back to Windows XP, and try out some overclocking, because usually with low-end GPUs from that time period, they overclock surprisingly well. This card was a smidge more tricky though. All I could do was increase the core clock to 700 MHz and the memory to 450 MHz. Increasing the slider any more on both ends would cause some instability and or artifacts. But is it enough to improve the experience a little bit? I tested this with only some of the games tested on XP, and can confirm that yes, performance did increase a bit. What a shocker. It's not anything spectacular, but getting around 12 to 15% increase in average FPS for basically free is no slouch. If any of you poor souls are still suffering with old low-end GPUs, overclock that shit ASAP. It's worth it. Before the conclusion, I have to point out that I have been using the latest official drivers on both XP and 7, so that's Catalyst 13.4 Beta and 13.9 respectively. In my opinion, they weren't the greatest drivers I have ever used. With both of them, Quake 3 ran pretty poorly. I don't know why, but it ran really badly. I also have been told that older drivers could be faster, so that would be an interesting idea for a future video, should you guys want to see that. Also, the passive cooler that Asus uses on this card is pretty good. You won't see much more than 60 degrees even when overclocked, which isn't a surprise given the 20 watt TDP. Anyways, given that this video is kinda long, I'm gonna keep it short. My conclusion for this video is that, as I expected, the Radeon HD 4350 wasn't a great gaming GPU even back then. I hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video. A thumbs up would be appreciated, as well as subscribing to my channel. Can we get 1k please? And if you'd like to support my content further, you can also join my Patreon. Anyways, I'll see you around.